Welcome back. Part 2 of Tommy Cowan's interview continues with an in-depth look at the cut-up method and why it's relevant to Burroughs' beliefs about the archons and what these beings are. We also discuss Gnosticism and the links to Burroughs' ideas, how Burroughs viewed magic, and why Tommy personally finds Burroughs so interesting. Okay, enough blah blah, let's get back into it. If we can get back to The Soft Machine, you were talking about his later books after The Exterminator. You mentioned The Soft Machine. That is a part of a series of books that is referred to by critics and scholars, if I am understanding correctly, because I'm also not a literary scholar. But Soft Machine is a part of a Nova trilogy. Is that correct?
Well, it's very complicated.
Okay. Is it? Can you say it? Can you make that statement that it's a part of the Nova trilogy or not? Am I incorrect?
Many people do say that, but I don't.
But you
I don't
disagree.
think they should.
Okay,
yeah.
You disagree. So, let's just talk about this then. Let's talk about these books because you also mentioned in your thesis, if I recall correctly, that there are also other books that are connected with this idea of talking about this demonic, insect-like possessive creature, these entities that are causing havoc for human beings. And as I am not an expert at all, I'm curious to know if you think that there is some kind of progression in his work where he starts to come to new insights about what's going on with these archons in his literary work.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Short answer, I would say yes. There's definitely a progression. Oftentimes it's sort of these ideas that he has about these possessing entities, especially if you look at it in something like Junkie or even Naked Lunch or something like that. It almost seems like it's genuinely kind of this alien thing. It's this thing that is completely separate from you that somehow gets inside of you. But then I think over the course of his career beyond Naked Lunch, and you really see this kind of starting to take shape in the Nova books, or the Nova movement, if we want to call it, is this concept that these entities are not just non-human invaders, but they actually partially compose human existence. So human existence is sort of a synthesis of this primordial consciousness with this parasitical kind of insect consciousness.
Okay. Would this be like linked to our reptilian brain and things like that, as far as evolution is concerned?
Well, so that's a very interesting question. So in the 1968 edition of The Soft Machine, I know, and I'm not sure, this might be part of the 1966 edition as well. There's an appendix to The Soft Machine where he's sort of the official narrative, quote unquote, of the novel has ended, and Burroughs starts talking very straightforwardly, and I believe he says something tantamount to like things like the id and the ego are actually the result, is actually a parasitic infection of the brain. So, and part of this pattern that Burroughs scholars has of kind of explaining away this stuff is they'll sort of twist Burroughs' language a bit to sort of make it more metaphorical. Eric Mottram is sort of like the first, Burroughs scholar that was respected by the Academy, and he wrote this book called The Algebra of Need. And in The Algebra of Need, he sort of misrepresents this appendix, and he says like, oh, Burroughs says the ego is, like a parasitic infection of the brain, or it's a simile. But that's not actually what Burroughs says in this appendix. He says it is.
Right. That's very different. It's not like it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very different.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Maybe we should continue talking about the archons then, because you bring a new term to the study of these parasitic possessive entities, and you call this archontic, and that is led from or taken from the word archon, of course, but there's a large history about this word archon, and we've been talking about archons kind of in a general way here, but I don't know if many people know what archons are and how they have developed as a concept. In religious studies, of course, archons are entities that make up a part of the very old concept of Gnosticism. But this word also, incidentally, has been used by modern-day pop culture figures such as David Icke to represent lizard and insectoid-like creatures that make up a part of his own conspiracist worldview. Now, while we're not going to go into this, but the word is floating around a lot. So it seems to be a word that people are using for perhaps different purposes. I'm not certain as far as David Icke is concerned. But I think maybe it would be good to give some context about this term. So let's try to make some sense of the archons, what they are, what they allegedly do. And if you could give a little synopsis of the Gnostic archons of antiquity, and then follow up with how you are using the term and also your term archontic. And then we can continue on with Burroughs and how he's talking about archons, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Well, I'm not an expert on late antiquity by any means, but I'll do my best to sort of relay what I know as I understand it. So archon is a word derived from Greek and roughly means ruler or kind of leader, but I believe there's also another speculated etymology related to the word archaios, which sort of means like ancient one or primitive one. But at any rate, there's several Gnostic groups in late antiquity used this word, such as like the Setians, to describe these primordial astrological entities that were considered responsible for imprisoning the soul of primal man in the world of matter. Basically, it's the archon's fault that we're stuck in these stupid human bodies and we're blocked from the ineffable wisdom of monadic non-being, if you will. As such, these archons are demiurgic figures, and usually I believe they're either subservient to the demiurge or they sort of collectively compose the demiurge itself.
Okay, and just to jump in, demiurge is the concept of this spiritual being that thinks it is God, as the Christians understand the concept of God, the creator of the heavens and earth, as is talked about in the Bible, thinks he is that, but he is not that. Correct?
Correct.
All right.
Correct, yeah. As to why the demiurge and the archons trap us in the world of matter, I think this kind of varies a little bit depending on the tradition. Some thinkers claim that the demiurge was jealous of primal man. I think others claim that it's more just kind of like an error or like an accident caused by ignorance, because there's Sophia is usually a big part of all these Gnostic creation myths, and she's the personification of the metaphysical force of primordial wisdom. And in many versions of this myth, she foolishly tries to comprehend the monad, but in the process of this error, she kind of fragments the universe by ontological necessity into all these different planes of existence. So I think there's some variation as to why these archons exist. But as I said, they were almost always associated with astrological energies and planet spheres. And in late antiquity, it was believed that astrology was deeply connected to many processes of the natural world, including the human body. So we actually have this really complex and very kind of mind-bending conceptualization here, because the archons are not just these invisible, non-human demon things, but they're also part of the natural world. They partially compose our material existence, and they partially compose our bodies and nature, which is a little bit similar to Burroughs, if you recall sort of how I mentioned his ideas develop. And so what this does is this positions the natural world as something that's conspiring against you, so to speak. And so therefore your body's desire for food and drink, your desire for sex, your desire to fight against pain, these are all things determined by astrological providence, and they're sort of things that are designed to keep you inside your body and keep you trapped in this as this imperfect kind of human animal. And so as a result of this cosmology, I think any Gnostic thinkers who promoted these ideas of bodily rejection, such as Basilides, for example, they also usually promote this a doctrine of archons. I chose the word archon in my own work because I basically just think it very accurately maps on to the kind of worldview that Burroughs had. He believed that there was a primordial spirit that was unfairly imprisoned in the world of matter. He believed bodily existence was not good. And he believed in these kind of invisible alien beings that kept us trapped here for their own benefit. But I sort of modify this word. I use the word archontic a lot as sort of an adjective, but archontic's actually not my word. That's a word that other scholars on Gnosticism will use, such as Kyle Fraser, for example.
Oh, okay. I apologize. I thought you were the one that came up with that. Sorry.
That's fine. So the word that I believe I am the one who invented this word is archantism, and so I essentially took archontic and I sort of made it into this noun, this sort of mode of thought, because I didn't want my work to get bogged down in sort of what's going on right now in Gnostic studies or biblical studies, where we have these very rigorous philologists, that are very invested in these deconstruction arguments, trying to deny Gnosticism as this useful category. And, I'm not an expert in this, so I can't, not only am I not able to sort of be involved in this argument, it doesn't help me to get involved in this argument. And, I could be accused of anachronism and whatever, but I still believe that what we see in ancient Gnosticism, this doctrine of archons, this is a transhistorical kind of tendency. This is somehow some type of psychological universal, perhaps, even if I can be so bold to say that. And so I decided to invent a new word for it, and that was archontism.
And by that you are referring to what?
The transhistorical, let's say, penchant to sort of identify processes of the natural world as conscious agents that are blocking your path to psychic transcendence.
Okay. Do you have any knowledge or have any hunches that Burroughs knew anything about Gnosticism?
There's a little bit. As to how much he knows about Gnosticism proper is hard to determine. He was an educated person. I mean, he went to Harvard and he studied literature, so it's not impossible that he had some contact with it. Like we know he reads Jung, for example, who was very interested in Gnosticism. But we don't see many explicit references in Burroughs' writing to Gnosticism. But what we do know is that in an interview one time, he once identified himself as a Gnostic or a Manichaean. So obviously he knows a little bit about it. Like he knows what Gnosticism is, and he knows what Manichaeanism is, and he certainly knows enough about it to know that the Gnostic worldview is similar to his own. But when and where he sort of came into contact with these ideas, I'm not really sure.
Okay, and did he refer to these insects, other words that he used for the entities? Did he call them archons?
No, he did not. That's sort of my application. That's me sort of like putting that label onto his theories.
But it fits within that tendency to view the body as being kind of like a prison. Correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that helps me to put it into a context of how these older ideas, even though they might not be specifically referenced, they are influencing perhaps Burroughs' worldview. Because if he's talking about this alien presence and these entities possessing the bodies and being a part of the brain and being a part of the actual organism of the body, then that would mesh together and just fit really, really well with this concept of archons, as you explained it, as they are understood in, from Gnosticism and ideas that have been around since antiquity. So, so this is helping me to put this into a framework, I guess. So coming back to Burroughs' style of writing then, his, of course, style of cut-up is very important. Was he the one that came up with this idea of cut-up method, or were there other people who were doing it at around the same time and they just kind of came up with it together, or could somebody be attributed to being the inventor of this method other than Burroughs?
Yeah, well, so like many things, the answer's a little complex. Burroughs always credited Gysin with the invention of cut-up. He always said Gysin invented it. But the Dadaist Tristan Tzara, who was a friend of Gysin's, interestingly, he did a similar thing like many years before that. Where he very famously composed a poem by pulling words out of a hat.
Right.
But I think the issue there, was or at least what's problematic about saying that Gysin invented cut-up is we should distinguish sort of how Burroughs uses cut-up and how Gysin and Tzara were doing it.
Exactly.
Gysin and Tzara were using cut-up as a gag. It was kind of like comedic to them. Okay,
so let's talk about how Burroughs was using cut-up.
Yeah. For him, it was something very serious. He did a lot more of it and took it to a much deeper theoretical extent than anyone before him had ever done. But I think, he was kind of headed in this direction before he and Gysin became friends a little bit. Essentially, there's all these stories of him taking texts. Sometimes these, or I should say, usually these texts are very specifically selected. And he's cutting these texts up in certain ways. So he's either cutting them into individual words, individual lines. He's folding the text on a horizontal or vertical axis. He's cutting the text into quarters and swapping the quarters around. And he's just kind of looking for any sentences that look interesting to him, that jump out. And, there's all these stories of him just compiling thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of cut up sentences, spending like all day kind of doing this exercise. And then, at the end of the day, he would go back to these cut up sentences and then have another selection process where he'd pick the ones that he liked that have some type of resonance or sort of a synchronicity with him. And those would go in the books. And like these things, like the Nova, the reason why I say I don't think we should call the Soft Machine part of the Nova trilogy is that not that the Soft Machine isn't a Nova book, but just that the Nova movement is not a trilogy. That's kind of my argument. And Oliver Harris, who's the most important Burroughs scholar of all time, he makes a very similar argument to this. But a synonym for the Nova trilogy is the Cut Up trilogy. But it also doesn't really make that much sense because yes, there's a lot of cut up in the Nova movement, maybe more cut up in the Nova movement than in other stuff that Burroughs did. But I mean, there's, the bulk of the 1966 edition of the Soft Machine isn't cut up. It's still a minority of cut up. And furthermore, he still uses cut up beyond the Nova movement. We see cut up in Wild Boys and other things like that. But yeah, this was something very serious to him. It had it had a magical meaning to him. This was an esoteric magical praxis for him.
So, what is he trying to achieve then with the cut up, and what does that have to do with these aliens that are possessing him?
Yeah, it gets really, really complicated, and it's not, there isn't necessarily sort of like one answer per se. Let's talk a little bit about Burroughs' theories of language. So Burroughs believes that language is an epistemological prison, right? So it restricts your consciousness. It places limits on what you're able to think, what you're able to conceive. So language is this vital part of upholding the illusion of bodily consciousness that sort of shields us from the metaphysical truth of our slavery. In his terminology, he calls this illusory sort of bodily world time. But there's another world, like a primordial, timeless kind of world, where we can exist in an almost languageless state of consciousness, and he calls this primordial world space. And so the goal for him was always to achieve consciousness of space through any means that he could. And so his theory about the cut-up's ability to affect the mind is really related to his thoughts on hieroglyphs. For example, at the time he believed that written language predated verbal language. And I think this was not an uncommon belief among some anthropologists. I don't think that's a common belief today, as it's definitely not believed by most animal behaviorists. But this is what Burroughs believed. And he believed the first written language was pictographic or hieroglyphic, and that this is important because pictures can convey complex meaning much more rapidly than phonetic language can. Mm-hmm. Because phonetic writing or alphabets, they require this temporal dimension to sort of unfold the language gradually. But the language of pictures operates on a much faster kind of dynamic in our brain. And so he argued that hieroglyphic writing it's more metaphysically pure than phonetic writing because space consciousness is a consciousness sort of void of temporal limitations. So the language of space also has to kind of be void of temporal limitation, if you could even call space consciousness to have language. Therefore, logically, like in his mind, whichever writing system had the least temporal restriction would be the closest to space, if you will.
Okay.
So his ideas about cut-up, about how cut-up could alter consciousness, are related to this negation of time. And so this subversion of temporal restriction is about by abandoning grammatical normality and coming up with all these novel juxtapositions of words and images, juxtapositions that wouldn't normally occur in conventional contexts, you're challenging the phonetical processing center of the brain to cognize language in a different way. And this could sort of defy the temporal restrictions that are embedded in grammar. And if you look at The Exterminator, what he implies is that by using cut-up for alterations of consciousness, this can allow you to perceive the archon or perceive these alien masters because you're challenging the grammar addiction and the time addiction that the archon uses as part of its own biology. And so therefore, perhaps the archon maybe must reveal itself in order to sort of correct you and confront you. I think the cut-up for him as a way to alter consciousness, it's not just an escape, but it's a form of confrontation, a way to confront the possessing entity, which he often calls this possessing archon a language virus, which is a very interesting phrase.
Is he trying to expel this entity?
I think he's trying to kill it.
Okay.
Ultimately.
But if that entity
that was
is
the ultimate goal.
okay, I'm having some trouble here. If this entity is a part of the human being, because it's a part of the brain, doesn't that then follow that you're killing yourself if you're killing the alien entity that's possessing you? Or is this is this literal or is this metaphorical?
Oh no, he believed that bodily existence was bad, and that you need to escape the body. I mean, the world of matter is not anything to revere at all, according to him.
But he did think that consciousness was able to exist without a flesh body, the meat suit.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, correct. Yeah. You didn't need the meat suit.
Right. Okay. So he's not actually going around telling people to kill themselves, but he's expressing this struggle that he has with being in this physicality with his writing.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so and the magic part then comes in. I'm having a difficult time understanding how, if you said the cut up method is magical practice, what's the magic there then?
Well, so it's disputed. It's disputed as to when Burroughs comes up with this idea of magical writing. So, for example, Burroughs publishes a book in 1985 called The Adding Machine, and it's essentially just a series of essays. And one of these essays in The Adding Machine is called The Fall of Art. And it's been argued by James Grauerholtz, who was Burroughs' personal friend and secretary and one of his editors for many years, that according to the Fall of Art essay, we can identify a moment in time when Burroughs did not believe that writing was magic. And it's according to this encounter he has with a painter in 1968, where Burroughs asks the painter, what's painting all about? And the painter sort of just replies, well, what's writing all about? And Burroughs says, I couldn't answer him at the time, but now I know the answer. The answer is magic. And so there's this school of thought in Burroughs studies that the magical theory of Burroughs writing doesn't emerge until after 1968. But I think this is incorrect, because if you look at his letters to Allen Ginsberg after Jones' death, when Ginsberg is writing these routines, these sort of comedic routines as he's composing the book Queer, and he's mailing some of these comedic routines to Louis Marker in an attempt to kind of woo him, Ginsberg, and he's also sent some of these same routines that he sent to Marker, he's also sending to Ginsberg. And Ginsberg replies to one of these letters, and he says to Burroughs, what you're doing with these letters and with this routine writing, you're attempting to do black magic. And it's not really clear how literal Ginsberg means this, but this is in 1952, well before 1968. And Burroughs replies to Ginsberg, and his reply is very interesting. And he says, "Of course, I'm attempting to do black magic." So there's circumstantial evidence that Burroughs believes in writing as magic way before cut up. And even as a boy, there's this book called A Report from the Bunker, which is basically a bunch of interviews with Burroughs as he's sort of living a bohemian lifestyle in New York and hanging out with all these rock stars. And Burroughs is telling a story of being a teenager at the Los Alamos Boys Ranch, which is where he went to school for a period of time. And as an adolescent there, he knew he was homosexual, and he falls in love with another boy at the school. And he starts writing detailed sexual fantasies in his diary about him and this other boy. And then something happens. I forget exactly what. Burroughs has to leave the school. He's not going to be attending there anymore, but he leaves his valuables behind, and the valuables have to be mailed to him to his home in St. Louis. And he has this anxiety attack, sort of considering, that like maybe the boys found his diary and they're reading about all these sexual fantasies that he has with this other boy. And he was so embarrassed, and he's really, distraught about this. So as soon as he gets the box of his belongings sent back from Los Alamos, he tears through the box, goes right to the diary, and destroys it. He just rips it up. But in this interview and report from the bunker, he refers to this diary as a grimoire. Now, this is 1970s Burroughs kind of reflecting on his time as an adolescent in, this would be maybe like the late 1920s. But in my opinion, the fact that even as an older person reflecting on this memory, the fact that he called this diary a grimoire sort of suggests that he thought about this as a magical act when he was like 13, 14. Which is, way before he even publishes his first thing in his high school paper. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that the Grauerholtz thesis is wrong. That Burroughs believes in writing as a form of magic way before cut-up, and so cut-up just kind of gets appended to this concept that already exists. Okay,
so in that sense, then magic is associated with words, as is by a lot of people associate magic with special words that you say in a particular way, in a particular pattern. So, but this would then tie back to his interest from a very young age in the idea of what language can do. Correct? So yes. Do you think then that what you just said about cut-up being added to this, that this was just another form of using language as magic, and he didn't see it as anything spectacular? It was just another way that he was using language?
Well, so it's sort of, it's something that I think was kind of building in him for a long time. So like if you go back to, like what the origins of what he claims the origins of cut-up are, he claims that it's from Brian Geisen. However, there's this movement towards cut-up, I think is building long before then, because, a part of the Nova movement is actually a series of movies. So, and in one of these movies is called The Cut-Ups. I believe it came out in 1968, maybe. I'd have to double check that. There's a scene in this movie where there's someone sitting in front of a table or a desk, and there's a book on this desk. And this book is a book written by an English doctor named John Dent, and it's called Anxiety and Its Treatment, and it comes out in 1947. And this book, Anxiety and Its Treatment, it advocates sort of a free association language exercise as a therapeutic supplement for anxiety and repression. So the fact that this book makes an appearance in the cut-ups is something we should take note of. What sort of ties this all together is that Burroughs and John Dent were very familiar with one another because Burroughs was a patient of John Dent. He went to England to receive an addiction treatment called the apomorphine cure. And in later works, Burroughs associates cut-up with apomorphine. There's all of this sort of contextual evidence that Burroughs is, his thinking sort of around experimental language itself, like the seed of cut-up already exists before he sees what Geisen is doing. In terms of why he thought what Geisen was doing was the answer to the questions that he had, I'm not exactly sure as to why that is, but I think part of the reason is what he thought was an ability to sort of disrupt the future, perhaps, because he believes that the future is pre-recorded, right? So the archons have already written the future. Well, so if you take any language that's written with normal grammar structures and then you mix it up, you're sort of scrambling time itself, and therefore by scrambling time, you're playing with what the future can be. You're creating a chaotic potential for the future.
So an alternate reality then for the future.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Okay.
And he claimed you could do lots of things like this. For example, divination. He claims that he predicted certain events using cut-up sentences, but of course he didn't realize that the cut-up was predicting this event until the event happened, and then he goes back to the cut-ups and identifies it there. So it's this very Jungian kind of synchronicity thing that he's doing. But also one time in this literary conference in Scotland in 1962. He tells this audience that he caused a plane crash by using cut-ups. And I think his contention is that this happens accidentally. But somebody in the audience sort of interrupts him. They go, "Are you serious?" And he says, "Perfectly."
But was he really? That's the thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we obviously can't be inside of his head. But.
No, but it's interesting to contemplate, though, because at first I thought his intention with the cut-up was to kind of like eradicate existence of the self, of the human being. But now it seems like there's this other dimension of the magic, then the magic part being used for something a little bit more positive, I guess, maybe in my perspective, more positive, that you can actually alter your own future if you use this method of cut up. And was he also thinking in that way?
Yeah, he claimed.
I mean, in a positive way, in a positive sense.
Well, I mean, I guess positive is maybe a tricky term here. He believed he was using writing to get things for himself. So, for example, I believe he once claimed that, a character that he wrote in a pornographic scene one time sort of later appears in his life and becomes sort of one of his sexual partners. Right? So he claims that you could use writing to procure sex.
But that then, if you're talking about magic, that would also be a goal of magic, to get things that you want. Magicians do that all the time. They do rituals because they want certain things. So they want certain things to happen. They want a certain outcome. So Burroughs is not so different in that sense. He's just using a different method.
Right.
Okay. So that kind of leads me to my next question about the influence that he's had on people within various occult circles. He had his own particular ideas of what he was doing with the cut-up method and how that was a magical practice. But why were other people so taken with that?
It's a really good question, and I'm not entirely certain. Obviously, I think part of it is that Burroughs is very unique. I mean, there's really nobody like Burroughs. As soon as you familiarize yourself with a Burroughs book, you realize that there's no other writer in history that's even similar to this guy. In my opinion, he's his own genre. I think. So I think there's some type, just the uniqueness of him has a certain appeal, but he's also very polarizing too.
Correct.
So I think about it kind of like this sometimes, where it's been said of the Velvet Underground that they didn't sell many albums, but almost everyone who bought an album started a band. And I sort of think a similar thing is going on with Burroughs. Like, most people don't read Naked Lunch or haven't read Naked Lunch, but it seems like a lot of the people who did read Naked Lunch became writers. And being such a polarizing figure perhaps also kind of intensifies the reverence of him if you are someone who reveres him. So I think most people think Burroughs is unreadable, but almost everyone who doesn't think he's unreadable thinks he's a genius. And I think we could liken that sort of that polarizing dynamic to esotericism and occultism as well. So like most people in industrialized societies think esotericism is stupid, but most of the people who don't think it's stupid, they get really into it. Both Burroughs and esotericism are very kind of polarizing topics. And so I think when you get someone who's coincidentally both into esotericism and into Burroughs, then these polarizing energies, if you will, maybe they have some kind of compound effect. And so he gets launched into this prophet status. People have referred to him as a prophet before, for example.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Okay.
And I think, Burroughs isn't just unique among writers. He's also unique among esotericists in the sense that he doesn't situate himself within any kind of hierarchy or ritual traditions. He draws from many various sources and traditions, but he encourages full-blown experimentation and independent thinking. And he's really probably the genesis of chaos magic, or if you don't agree with my assessment there, I think we have to at least admit he certainly was a chaos magician before the term came into being.
Right.
Yeah. And if someone would like to rebuttal that by noting how the Golden Dawn drew from many various historical sources, therefore maybe Burroughs not that unique in that respect. I would note that the Golden Dawn synthesized their various influences into a much more contiguous kind of ritual structure, and they integrated this sort of ritual structure into a very hierarchical initiatic system of gradual revelation. And with Burroughs, you have none of that. It's completely DIY. There's no hierarchy. There's no contiguous kind of ritual structure. It's very do-it-yourself. And I think people were attracted to that because it's much more accessible. I think it's not a coincidence that chaos magic emerged in England at a time when Burroughs was living and writing in England. And I think another thing that's unique about Burroughs for an esotericist in the 1960s is, he checks sort of like an unusual grouping of boxes in the sense that, okay, yes, he's an esotericist. He's also an acknowledged literary talent with a degree of mainstream success. That's not related to esotericism, because a lot of people missed the esoteric aspect of Naked Lunch. He's also openly homosexual, which I think a lot of esotericists maybe before him were not. And he's also uproariously funny, which, he's maybe the funniest esotericist I've ever read. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, and maybe somebody will correct me later on if they listen to this and want to correct me. I don't know of a lot of esotericists at that time that had this kind of range, and certainly not many that were prime advocates of LGBT liberation. So, I think he's just a really unique figure.
What do you think is the biggest misconception of Burroughs?
Well, like I just mentioned, I think that the esoteric dimensions of Naked Lunch, which is, like I said, still his most widely read book, sometimes it goes over people's head, and also, this tendency for a few Burroughs scholars to try and explain away his interest in magic as something that wasn't that serious. So the misconception is, that he wasn't serious when he actually was. If I can tell you a story,
Sure.
A personal story. I met a guy at a party one time in Amsterdam, and we started talking about Burroughs. And this man had read Naked Lunch, and I told him about what I did, and he said something sort of tantamount to, Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, there's magic in Burroughs, but it's not part of any bigger philosophy that Burroughs had. He was just a nihilist, and he's only into magic because it's fun. And this is sort of like a simulacrum of what, some of these other scholars have said in the past, that it's not really that serious. But I was forced to disagree with him there in the middle of the party. I don't think Burroughs is a nihilist. I think he's an archontic Gnostic and an anarchist, but I don't think that equates to nihilism. And I think the historical evidence is very clear that he's deadly serious about magic. Believed in it, believed it worked, did a bunch of it over the course of his life, and thought it was a path to salvation for him. And as evidence of my position here, if any of the listeners want like a little homework project, I would encourage them to go to Naked Lunch and look at the very first sentence of the book, because the first sentence of Naked Lunch is about magic. And it's a sentence that you could really easily pass over without realizing that it's about magic. But once you know it's about magic, then it's unmistakable and you can see it. And my argument is that it's not random that the first sentence of Naked Lunch is about magic. I think it's actually very significant that the magic is contained in the first sentence. And it signals to us that there's a deeper level of involvement here, that it's not coincidentally part of the book, but it's somehow central to it.
I see. This is all very, very interesting. I have one more question for you. And it's kind of a personal question. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah.
But what is it about Burroughs that attracts you so much?
Well, so I originally got interested in William Burroughs because of the David Cronenberg movie. And so that was my entry point. I saw that as a young man. I think I was probably 19 years old.
But I understood
saw
that's
this movie.
Not really, it doesn't really follow the book though, correct?
Oh, no. I mean, the book is impossible to make a movie from. You can't do it.
All right. I'm sorry. Please continue.
But I think the movie is really good, and it does an excellent job of synthesizing parts of Burroughs' biography, but also sort of conveying a vibe that Burroughs' writing has, and having it be just weird and random enough, but also having enough narrative continuity that you don't get totally bored. I think the movie's really good. It's a masterpiece in my humble opinion. But so I love this movie, and a few years, so I have Burroughs in the back of my mind for a while. I think I'm thinking like, okay, I should read this Naked Lunch, and I read Naked Lunch maybe a couple years later, or a few years later even, and I remember being, I forget exactly which part it was I was reading, but I remember being on the train, being on public transportation, reading this book. And I start laughing really, really hard. Like I'm almost crying, laughing. People are kind of looking at me, and I'm like holding this book. I don't know if I should just be like, it's funny, maybe kind of close. I don't know if anybody knows what Naked Lunch is. I may be trying to like hide it for a second so that people don't see what I'm reading, because the book, if people know what the book is, maybe they'll think I'm laughing at something I shouldn't be laughing at.
Okay.
But it's been said by other critics that I think Burroughs' greatest quality is his sense of humor, and he really is very, very funny and witty, and just a really brilliant, talented writer, but also happens to be a very influential esotericist with really unique theories about how the world worked and how you could deal with this problem of bodily consciousness.
Now that you know the codes and how to decipher the codes, does that make reading Burroughs also like a magical practice for you?
That's an excellent question. I believe yes. So I believe that. Writing is a form of magic. This is something that the CCRU, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, which was this philosophy collective in England in the 1990s, that's something that they referred to as hyperstition. And so that's a more popular term for it now. part of the reason why they argue that hyperstition works is not just that someone writes something down, but it works as a form of magic because other people read the thing that someone wrote. And I think that Burroughs implies this as well. And so the implication overall for the reader is that to read Burroughs, or certainly to read anything from the Nova movement, is to participate in a collective magical ritual. And when you know that as you read it, it gives a really interesting energy to the book.
That's interesting, because hyperstition is the idea that with this narrative that you're creating, a fiction, that you're making it real, but you have to have, in this case, you have to have people reading it. So it influences people, and then that changes the future. And it doesn't matter if it isn't real at the time of reading. It can still be a virtual thing, or it's not actual, not in the physical world as what we consider actual and real. But by engaging with the text, it ends up changing the future. If I'm explaining this correctly. It's funny that you bring this up, because one of my future podcast episodes will be about hyperstition, because I find this to be a very interesting topic. So it's good that you bring this up, so this can kind of start to spark people's minds and make them start thinking about it, hopefully in any case. But is there anything else that you'd like to add that you think is important that we didn't talk about?
Gosh, I could probably keep talking, but I think we hit like a lot of the really good, a lot of the really most important points, and I think you ask a lot of really excellent questions.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. I was a little bit hesitant, I guess, and wary, because I really don't know that much about Burroughs other than what I've learned by reading your work and then other people's work that you've referenced when doing the research for this interview. But I've gained a really, I guess, a deeper, not only deeper understanding, but a deeper respect for Burroughs, and it has spurred me on to actually read his work, whereas before, just like you said, I had tried to read him in the past and I just couldn't understand him. But now that I understand a little bit more about the background of his thinking and his worldview, I think I can approach it again with new eyes, and I can crack the code myself in a way, I guess. And I think that will, it's going to be an enriching experience, I think, because like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I had heard about Burroughs. I knew that he was so influential for people. And I felt it was kind of, I was experiencing a sense of poverty because I didn't really know why he was so influential. So I feel like I've been enriched in this aspect in talking to you about William Burroughs today. And I thank you very much for agreeing to come talk to me today. I think this is going to be really fun to hear back from people about your little homework assignment. Can you read it? Can you repeat that again for the people who might not have been listening, sitting in the back of the class talking to each other?
Go pick up a copy of Naked Lunch if you don't have one, or wherever you can find it. Burroughs would probably approve if you stole it. Mind. And read the first sentence of the first chapter, because it's about magic.
And do they have like a writing assignment attached to this?
Oh God, that's a good. Yeah, if I want to be a good instructor, I guess I don't know. Email me and tell me what you think.
Okay. Okay.
You yeah, you can find me on academia.edu under Tommy P. Cowan.
Okay, I will, of course, add all of this information to the podcast notes. I'll also add some titles for people who are interested to learn more. I'll link your articles and your thesis on the podcast notes as well. And of course, give the website and everything, because you've written a lot of interesting stuff about Mr. Burroughs, and I think that a lot of people might benefit from it. So, thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. This was a pleasure, and I'm honored that you asked me to speak with you.
I hope you've enjoyed this interview with Tommy Cowan, and I thank him again for taking time out of his day to talk with me. If you'd like to know more about Tommy and read his work, you can find him on www.academia.edu. Just put Tommy P. Cowan, C-O-W-A-N, in the search bar. References mentioned in the interview will be listed on the website. And please leave some feedback about what you think or any questions you might have. And I hope you'll join me for the next episode. Thanks for listening.